I want to talk a little bit about a research agenda that I'm really just starting, really in its nascent stages, about how the state collects and uses information about sex and gender. And this fits pretty nicely within the theme of several talks right here about the datification of the self, because it relates to how both the state's commitment to using sex and gender for certain classification or certain purposes connects with trends toward automation. And then a particular thing that I think we need to add to that conversation is a trend toward managerialism in the automated state. So this project or this research agenda is about how these three trends intersect and the problems that they create for those who are transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. We have growing exponential growth in algorithmic technologies that are committed to using gender as a metric to identify or predict or identify fraud, for example. We have an administrative state that is trending to be far more automated, far more algorithmically oriented. And again, the tools that the administrative state is using based on their continued use of thousands and thousands of forms that collect sex and gender data in order to do all sorts of things, like detect fraud or maintain security at airports and so forth, are the continued algorithmization and automation of the administrative state brings with it trends toward entrenching the gender binary. And then a lot of that has been discussed already. But what hasn't been connected to this story is the growth of, or the expansion and entrenchment of, the managerial turn in the regulatory state. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means. But altogether, the question for the next few minutes is, what happens to transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming individuals when algorithmic technologies meet an administrative state, an automating administrative state, and the forces of managerialism? So the spoiler, nothing good, but the argument that I want to make is that the reason why nothing good happens is part of the nature embedded in algorithmic technologies, in the administrative state, and in managerialism itself. What happens here is almost like a perfect storm of erasure and discrimination, such that forms of redress are just foreclosed, simply not available. I should say traditional forms of redress are simply foreclosed or not available to sexually minoritized populations. The features of each part of this triangle, it's really not a process, it's more of a triangle. The features of each part of this triangle, each of these forces coming together, encode the gender binary and foreclose redress through traditional legal methods. So I'll go through each of them. So algorithmic technology, how do algorithmic technologies encode gender? This really isn't, what I'll discuss in the next few minutes really isn't new, just trying to provide a baseline so we're all pretty much on the same page. And also, I'm not a computer scientist. I may teach in part at a computer science school, but I have a PhD in sociology. So I'm always happy to learn from some of our more tech experts in this space. But for a very brief summary, one type of algorithmic technology that encodes gender are the data matching types of technologies. These are the ones that ask, are these two sets of characteristics from these two data points or these two places, are they referring to the same person? Those are fraud checks, right? So the state uses those all the time to determine if you are committing Medicaid fraud, if you are the person who's applying for a professional licensure. That is the reason why various state departments ask for sex and gender on these forms. I'll say, I'm coming at this project from having done both a quantitative analysis of thousands of state government forms that ask sex and gender questions, as well as qualitative research involving interviews with frontline workers who build these forms. And then other types of data matching technologies are asked, do these characteristics of this person conform to a set of approved characteristics to make sure that you are who you say you are, or you're okay to proceed. So gender is a significant data point in all of these. An example here, again, paying honor to Sasha's work, who highlighted the way in which the millimeter wave detection scanners at airports are ill-suited to recognizing transgender and gender nonconforming and non-binary individuals, because they try to connect any particular person coming through the airport with a model of what a masculine presenting person is, or someone associated with the male gender or sex and someone associated with a female gender or sex. There are also lots of other options that don't get talked about as much, simply because forms are not super sexy, but government forms are where most of us interact with the government, right, all the time. This is just one example of hundreds of inconsistent examples that I found during my research. These are two forms, the tops of two forms from the Colorado Department of Labor. And when you get injured in Colorado, you want to submit a claim for compensation. You fill out the form on top where you have an empty box where you can list your gender. And in Colorado, X is allowed as a gender marker on various official documents, but also this is a box. Like, it doesn't explain how you're supposed to answer this question. The problem is your employer has to fill out a form for the same injury, right, in order for you to be eligible to get workplace compensation. And good luck getting compensation if those gender designations do not match. But notice how the question is also built to make it so that the only people for whom this is automatically going to match are for people whose expression and deeply held sense of self accord with their gender assigned at birth. Because the second form doesn't even tell you if it's asking for sex or gender, right? So that leads to great confusion, especially for people who are transgender. And also you could have an X in one box and male and female in another one, and then automatically you are considered trying to engage in fraud, right? So we have tons of examples of this from lawsuits out of Michigan and Wisconsin and other states, where these types of inconsistencies have led to allegations and full-on trials and damage rewards for fraud. So of course, the only people that those inconsistencies harm are going to be trans, non-binary, et cetera. There are other types of technologies as well, like data mining technologies is another really popular and good example for this. Is this person's characteristics correlated with certain patterns of behavior? Gender is another significant data point here. Of course, a really great example is the Gender Shades Project from Timothy Gebru, who spoke earlier, Joe Gulamani, et cetera, and so many others who have done work showing how Black women's faces are poorly identified using this technology, right? So gender is a significant data point in these technologies, but again, it's really poor, right? So the mistakes are constant. So gender is encoded in these technologies. Gender is often coded in these technologies in a binary way, not well, but it's often encoded in a binary way. If it's hard for Black women to get identified, well, imagine how difficult it is for someone whose facial characteristics do not conform to what everyone traditionally assumes is how a male's face is supposed to look like, or a face associated with a male designation in another part of the algorithm. So why are algorithmic technologies likely to encode the gender binary? There are lots of reasons. Again, this part here isn't new. The fact that they identify what algorithms do is identify probabilistic determinations. They work in the aggregate. They don't focus on individuals. In fact, that's their whole purpose. Historical training data is almost all binary, almost all binarized. There are political and normative decisions made at the beginning of the creation of these algorithms that are done by people who are not necessarily representative of transgender and non-binary individuals. And of course, the demographics of designers, there are tons of other explanations. I think we can all assume that these binaries are going to be embedded in these technologies. The features of the automated state also make it more likely that the gender binary is going to be embedded into the tools of the administrative state. So here are some features of the administrative state and some reasons why the technologies that they use, again, to detect fraud and other than determine security and so forth and other things are already going to embed the binary. Automation of administrative function reduces the discretion of street-level bureaucrats, SLBs, street-level bureaucrats from Michael Lipsky's work 30 years ago already. The result of that is that when you reduce the discretion of individual people who are making decisions about other individual people, you're only getting aggregate decisions, right? You're getting how most people would fit a particular story when you reduce the discretion of individual people, not that the civil service is so LGBTQ friendly, but when you reduce individual discretion, you're at the mercy of aggregate decisions, which are automatically going to erase and exclude. Automated decisions reduce stakeholder input. And when you reduce stakeholder input, as my research has shown, one of the reasons why gender boxes or when forms ask these questions become more inclusive is because affected communities have had input into these forms. And that's not possible when you have an automated system. These systems are opaque. You can't interrogate them. You can't figure out why or how you're being erased or how you're being discriminated against. As Deirdre Mulligan and Ken Bamberger have shown a couple of years ago in their research, automation, the automated administrative state, one feature of it is that lawmaking is very informal, particularly through procurement of these technologies. Something that came up quite a bit in my research about why state forms are more homogeneous or heterogeneous when it comes to gender boxes is that even if frontline workers wanted to change a gender question on a form, they couldn't because the state went ahead and paid $78 million for a system that only has male or female in it, right? So even if there was a group of people that wanted to make a gender box more exclusive, they were foreclosed by that possibility because the state bought a system that only had two options. It also makes an end run about public input as well. The automated administrative state is also rife with public-private partnerships because guess who's making these technologies, right? Of course, they're mostly private companies, and they, of course, are driven by profit maximization as opposed to any type of social or human value, which really takes us to this third force, this third wave that's creating this perfect storm of discrimination, which is the problem of managerialism. Managerialism is, we often don't talk about, it's not front of line in lots of law reviews, but what I mean by managerialism is the increase in management values in the processes of government. Managerialism can also refer to the increase of managerial values or management values in other types of bureaucratic processes. But right now we're talking about the administrative state. And here I'm relying on the work, some of the work that I've done in the past, as well as the work of Julie Cohen in her 2019 book, Between Truth and Power. So managerialism, the features of managerialism is not just things like neoliberal governmentality, which is like cost benefit analyses, but also focusing on, how can we be more efficient, right? The goal of the agency should be efficient functioning. So things like that. So managerialism and neoliberal governmentality create agencies that lack resources. As a result, they do what's easy or they do what's path dependent. So what is tradition, which is the binary, gets future encoded. It also involves informal policy making. It reinforces informal policy making through things like best practice guides. And in fact, there are laws that require agencies to adopt best practice guides as law, right? As binding on their behaviors, right? So when industry develops these guides and best practice guides, this becomes law. And of course, those are less likely to incorporate gender diversity. Cost benefit analyses, of course, minimizes the harms that small populations, the effect that small populations will face harm. And when the trans or non-binary populations are so small, right, that doesn't mean that their harm is any less important to all of us, but when all you're doing is thinking about costs and benefits, right, those harms and costs are minimized. And of course, efficiency as a primary value, that means human rights are sidelined, and again, public-private partnerships. All of these together encode the gender binary. So I guess the question, and here's where I'll stop for the next 2 minutes, and that'll take me a little bit over, but I hope that's okay, Cynthia.
You're fine.
Each stage of this process encodes the binary. So I guess the question is, well, why can't we just fix it, right? But that's part of the perfect storm. the combination of algorithmic technologies, the features of algorithmic technologies, the features of the automated state, and the features of managerialism make it impossible to obtain redress. So here are some examples. Like someone might say, well, my tech bro friends tell me that all we need to do is to just make the data more inclusive, and then everyone's going to be included. Well, by focusing on this discoursive inclusive, I'm following here the work of Lauren Anna Hoffman, who talked about discursive violence, how what this does is it accepts the premise that these things are good things, right? And that we should be all part of this surveillance state, but also making minoritized populations more legible to a surveillance state is not necessarily a good idea. Why not just recreate the status quo ex ante with procedural due process? Okay, nice idea, but process has all been managerialized, right? It's been co-opted, whether it's deep capture or just change into checkbox, right? Like, let's fill out a impact assessment. Okay, let's check these boxes, right? The harms that transgender and non-binary people face are not going to make it to that level of changing the design of the product, because processes of the procedures and the mechanisms of procedural due process have all been managerialized and focused on efficiency as well. Plus, focusing on procedure does not deal with the structural reforms that are necessary in order to fix the surveillance state or make us less vulnerable to it. So can't we just use anti-discrimination law to handle bad things that happen as a result? Well, practical matter, good luck doing that with this judiciary. But more relevantly to the argument here is that the opacity of these systems, which is a feature of the automated administrative state, makes proving discrimination under traditional models really difficult. And the final thing is, okay, fine, let's agree that all those options are really bad. Let's just burn it all down, right? Let's just stop collecting gender data entirely. I am super sympathetic to burn it all down arguments. But as Jessica Clark has shown, like, there might be some reasons why we want to collect sex and gender data in order to benefit and help minoritized sex populations. So what might be an alternative here? What I want to do is not only bring the rule of law to the managerial turn, which involves private companies having to give up their trade secrecy when they work with the state, reform cost-benefit analysis in government, really change how OIRA and OMB works, go away from control rights of individual control rights to group rights. But I think what's most important is that we can't just bring the rule of law to the managerial turn. We have to bring anti-subordination law to the managerial turn. And what I mean by that is that any change that we focus on has to follow this one principle: that gender data should only be collected or used in ways that benefit or support the liberation of sex and gender minoritized groups. And, there are tons of other ways that we can ensure that airports are secure than gender-based scandals. There are tons of other ways to ensure that someone is not committing Medicaid fraud, a doctor or an individual, without using gender information. There are so many other ways that we can do it, such that it doesn't make any sense that we need to encode gender into these technologies simply because we are used to it. And there I'll end. Sorry for going a couple minutes over.
You didn't go over. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic.
Perfect. Yes. Okay. Thank you so much.